The wind across the Arizona desert carried stories and secrets. But on the evening Elias Mercer rode into that dying sun, it carried nothing but the dry rattle of hunger in his gut and the soft hush of prayers whispered by a man who owned nothing but an old mare, a broken holster, and a heart still stubborn, enough to believe kindness mattered. In a world that had long forgotten the word, Elias wasn't always broke. Once he'd been the sharpest shot north of the Verde River, a ranch hand with dreams, bigger than the paycheck he never got on time. But a wildfire, a failed harvest, and a string of bad decisions left him chasing ghosts and odd jobs from county to county. That day, with thirst chewing at his throat, he found something he never expected, a young Apache boy bleeding out beneath a scorched mesquite tree, the kind of wound left by a bullet that didn't care what side of the desert you belonged to. Elias knew what it meant. Touching an Apache was as dangerous as pointing a loaded gun at the entire Chiricahua nation. But leaving a child to die was something his conscience wasn't built to survive. With shaky hands and half a canteen, he cleaned the wound, tore strips from his last clean shirt, and whispered reassurance the boy couldn't understand, but somehow clung to. That moment when Elias lifted the child onto his mare and rode toward his crumbling shack of a home was the moment destiny changed its course, though he wouldn't feel its weight until the mountains themselves seemed to sprout, warriors like angry shadows. For 3 days Elias tended the boy, fever, shivers, delirium, until he finally spoke his name, Yiska, and with that name came the truth. The boy was the nephew of Chief DeSoto High, one of the most feared and respected Apache leaders of the region, a man who could muster hundreds of warriors with a single call across the canyons. Elias tried to laugh at the irony. He could barely feed himself, yet somehow he'd become guardian to the heir of a people who never forgot a kindness or a betrayal. On the 4th morning, as Elias chopped wood and wondered how long he could stretch 2 cans of beans between himself and the recovering boy, the horizon shifted. At first, it looked like dust stirred by a passing storm, but then shapes emerged, silent riders, dozens of them, faces painted, spears glinting, rifles slung across their backs, moving as if the earth itself had called them. Elias stood frozen, the axe slipping from his fingers, as more and more materialized until they covered the high ridge and spilled into the valley like a flood of shadows. 300 Apache warriors surrounded his lonely shack, and the land fell so quiet he could hear his own heartbeat arguing with his common sense. He had expected death, or at least judgment. But when Chief DeSoto High dismounted and approached him with eyes deep as riverstone, the boy Yiska stumbled from the doorway and uttered a single word that changed everything. Mercy. The chief studied Elias for a long, heavy moment, the kind that strips a man bare of every lie he has ever told himself, and nodded. "Your hand saved what many would have let die," he said in accented English. "We do not forget such things." Elias, stunned, could only nod back, unaware that the chief's next words would pull him into a storm larger than anything he'd faced. "But mercy," the chief continued, "brings consequences. And now you must face ours with us." From that moment onward, Elias's life was no longer his own. He had stepped into a world where debts weren't counted in coins, but in blood, loyalty and promise. And the Apaches had come not only to thank him, but to ask for help in a battle that would test the strength of his soul, the truth of his character, and the cost of one man's single act of mercy. Night fell quickly on the desert, but the 300 Apache warriors who now surrounded Elias Mercer's shack moved with such disciplined silence that it felt less like an army encampment and more like spirits, rearranging the shadows themselves. Elias tried to swallow his fear, but it clung to him like damp cloth as Chief DeSoto High explained the truth behind Yiska's injury. A group of mercenaries, white men hired by corrupt land barons, had begun raiding Apache villages, poisoning water sources, and capturing children to force the tribe off land rich with copper deposits. Yiska had escaped only by luck and had been shot in the attempt. As the chief spoke, his voice low like thunder waiting to break, Elias felt a rage rise within him, not because the Apaches were victims, but because he knew exactly the kind of men who had done it. The kind who rode into saloons, bragging of blood spilled and land stolen. The kind Elias could know, longer stomach after seeing what their cruelty had nearly done to one child. The Apaches didn't ask politely. They demanded Elias join them as a guide, a negotiator, a man who understood the language of cowboys yet had a heart that had already proven itself stronger than prejudice. Elias wanted to refuse, to cling to the tiny, fragile safety of his lonely existence. But as he looked at Yiska, alive because of him, he felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. So he rode with them into the night, across ridges lit by moonlight and canyons that swallowed sound, until they reached the mercenaries' camp at dawn. What he saw there hardened every thought he'd ever held: stolen livestock, chains meant for children, barrels of toxin ready to be dumped into rivers. Elias had thought himself a broke, wandering nobody, but standing beside 300 warriors, ready to reclaim their dignity, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. The confrontation was inevitable. The mercenaries woke, guns drawn, but they were nothing against the fury of a people defending their own. Elias, though he hated killing, found himself drawing his weapon only to protect Yiska and the warriors who had placed their trust in him. The battle was swift, brutal, and righteous, and when the dust settled, the land was silent again except for the low hum of the wind carrying away the echoes of gunfire. Chief Desodahe placed a hand on Elias's shoulder and said, "You are no longer a man without a place. You have stood with us, and we stand for those who stand for us." Elias felt tears burn his eyes, not from grief but from the overwhelming realization that a single act of mercy saving one boy had rewritten his destiny. When he returned home, he no longer felt the crushing loneliness of the desert. Instead, he felt its vastness welcoming him, knowing he had brothers across the land. Word spread far and wide that the broke cowboy who saved an Apache boy had changed the course of an entire conflict. And though Elias never asked for praise, the respect he earned became richer than any gold he could have mined. Years later, old-timers would tell his story around campfires, but none could truly capture the moment his life changed. Not when the Apaches arrived, not when he fought beside them, but the quiet moment he decided to save a child he didn't know. And for those hearing this tale today, let Elias's story remind you of something powerful. An act of kindness can echo louder than any gunshot in the canyon of history.